Hi, I'm Bonnie Zeidner. Welcome to my page. I am going to talk to you today a little bit about some of the nuances of springs using the Allegro to Reformer from Balanced Body. I would love to go over this topic because I know plenty of people who have acquired their reformers during the pandemic and maybe even before that. Because they wanted to have their home workouts available to them. And that is great, although a lot of people have only been familiarized with their springs in a class or private setting, and maybe those little nuances about the springs are not something that they're fully familiar with. So I would love to go over that with all of you today. I want to start a little bit talking about the benefits of spring resistance training. It is definitely something that still builds muscle a little bit differently than weights do, but you are building that muscle and creating strong bones. This is something that works both eccentrically and concentrically, so you will receive a tense intensity as you press your carriage out. You're resisting a spring tension there, and you're resisting your spring as it pulls you back in with that tension. So your muscles are working in each direction. It's a very beneficial and less taxing on the joint way of working the muscles than a weight workout would be. Heavier spring choices are not always going to be better. I will go over that a little bit later in the tutorial here. So let's talk about some of the tensions of your springs first. The Allegro 2 is going to come with 3 reds, 1 blue, and 1 yellow spring. Your reds are your heavy springs, your blue is your medium spring, and your yellow is your light spring. Oftentimes you will find in a studio, or maybe someone who you've purchased a reformer for, it might have a green spring, which is also a heavier spring. Your springs do have toggles at the ends of them, which are great to pick up and hook your springs with. So they're going to make it so that you don't have to grab the actual spring itself, and you want to avoid using the actual color-coded areas to hook on. That toggle just gives you a nice feature for that. Your springs have 2 rows to connect onto. There is a bottom loading section and a top loading or preloading section. Typically you will be working on your bottom loaded section, and if you do want to add maybe a little bit more tension than another full spring, you can bump your spring up to the top tier, and it will add just a little bit of additional tension. So let's say you're working on 2 springs and you want it to be a little bit heavier, but not a full, say, yellow spring, which is the lightest of the options. Like maybe the yellow spring is still too heavy when you add that on. So currently if I'm on a red and a blue spring and I can't add that yellow, maybe I just pop my blue spring up to the top loaded section or preloaded section. And that gives me just a little bit extra tension from the get-go, as well as the spring tension. So it's not quite the yellow, and it's a little bit more than the blue, and hopefully that will do the trick. Changing out your springs is also something that's important to go over. I see a lot of people switch their springs out in ways that can, put them at risk of hurting themselves. So if I wanted to add, let's say I'm on 1 red spring and I wanted to add a blue spring to my setting, I would take my blue spring and add it onto the hook before I took off my red spring, so that my carriage is stable throughout the whole transition. What I have seen and is unsafe is if I'm on my red spring and I go to add my blue spring, Maybe I take my red spring off and then my carriage is now mobile and I have to try to pull my spring back in and hook it up. It's not a great habit to get into. It does lead you for the opportunity to have an injury, fall off the reformer, anything is possible. Make this a habit of transitioning with adding a spring before taking off. It's just like putting your seatbelt on in your car. I have talked to people about how to store their reformer when not in use. There are the options to keep all of the springs on, maybe one spring on, or no springs on. He never comes in here. I don't know what he's doing here. If you leave all your springs on in the carriage, and it's a good option, all the springs are being evenly used at once. I like to keep the springs off so that my springs have more longevity and they are not being pulled at any time when I'm not using my reformer. If I were to load them up and I only wanted to use one spring, I would probably rotate which springs I'm using so that they're all equally being pulled at some point in time. Same goes with working out for using your red springs. Try to rotate those out so that you have some longevity in those red springs. They will start to decrease in their tension after time. So keep your eyes peeled on the quality of your springs as well, making sure there's no defects or anything along those lines. Maybe you want the carriage to be at the stopper so that you have the knowledge that no one's going to sit down accidentally and have the opportunity for it to slide out from underneath them. I have worked in studios where the carriage will be at the other end and stored at that end so that it's obvious that there are no springs on your reformer. And I've also worked in studios where it is held in at the stopper with the springs. So it is a personal preference. Let's talk about how a heavier spring can sometimes seem like you're gonna have a harder workout when that might not actually be the case. Maybe the lighter spring will actually be a harder workout. So if I wanted to start with my ab workout, let's say I'm on one red spring, and I want to work on some mini roll-ups. So if I'm on one red spring, there's a little bit of tension as I roll myself back. I come down and I still have the pull of the spring to kind of help me come up. It's challenging, but it's still manageable. So if I added, I'm thinking in my mind, let's make it harder. I'm gonna add another spring on. So that's a blue spring I'm adding to my red spring. If I roll back, there's a little bit more pull from the start, a little bit more challenge to come down. But the real work of this exercise is rolling back up and using the abs. And now I don't have as much work to do. The springs are actually pulling the carriage back, so it makes it easier when I've added that heavier weight. So if I switched it to a blue spring, which is the lighter option from the red, and I roll myself back, it's very easy to roll back, it's challenging, but once I come down here, I have very little spring help to guide me back up. I have to use more abs to come up. So my lighter spring is actually going to be harder for me to do my work on this exercise. So these are some nuances of how that spring tension can change and not necessarily make it easier or harder the way you would think in, say, weight training. Now I'm going to talk about some of the same concepts of that with combo work. So combo work is using the springs on the reformer in combination with the springs from the tower. I love using combo work, and I will do it in a variety of ways. Today I'm going to show you an example of using that with feet in the straps. Basically, it's either end working in conjunction with one another, and you want to find that moment in between where you can float. So your springs need to be at the right setting here and the right setting here to have that moment where you can be in the middle of your tower and your reformer to do the work. You want that balance. You don't want to be hitting the stopper at this end, and you don't want to be hitting the end at the tower end. You want a float. So as you push your legs into your springs, when we're doing the footwork here, or hip work I should say, you have that range going on where you have to float between each side. So I'm going to start on a red and a blue, and that might work for someone who is a certain size or weight, but for me it's going to be a little challenging, and I will show you how and why this is going to be. Springs are not the end all be all. They can be something that is challenged by, as I showed you with the mini roll-ups, just the spring themselves, but they can also be affected by someone's height or weight or ability. So there are areas in practice where you have to add a little bit more for one person or take away for another person or that same person. So I'm on red and a blue, and I'm going to grab my springs from the tower. I'm going to hook them 4 hooks up, which is where I would typically have this setting be for hip work with combo. You come onto your side and then onto your back. Because you are spring loaded from each side, you're going to have a little bit of a pull as you go to put your springs onto your feet. So I'm very close to the stopper. So on this spring for me, I have a lot of tension in my springs from the tower end because the reformer end is pulling me. So if I go to push in, I'm not going out very far. It keeps me much closer to the foot bar end of the reformer, and I want to be able to find a middle range in the space. So I'm going to switch this out. I'm going to go to a red spring. So in my red spring, I already feel a little bit more balanced between the spaces, and I'm going to find some movement. So I have a little bit more bounce, which is nice. The other thing about doing this particular exercise is thinking about very little movement pressing into my springs. My thighs are doing the work here. So this is pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and switch it to a blue spring so we can see the difference of the blue spring as well. So I'm adding my blue on, taking my red off. That could have been really tricky if I had just decided to do my blue spring without my red connected. So I'm a lot more towards the tower end now, I can feel. And when I press out, it shoots me a little too far back into my tower. So as you can see, this is going to be too light. So my happy medium is going to be my red spring for me. And a lot of times that's going to change. Hopefully this was helpful to give you a little bit of an insight into how springs work, a little bit of insight into some combo spring work. Maybe you don't have a tower, but you've wondered what happens on a tower. Why would I even want a tower? The spring settings offer a little bit of buoyancy, which is much like swimming or floating. It's very unusual. It's still a lot of work, but it's still light on the joints, which is great. I would love to hear what you thought of today's little video. If you have any questions, definitely drop a comment below. I hope this was helpful, and thanks for stopping by.